Imagine for just a moment a silence so profound the world seems to hold its breath. And in that stillness you hear something, not with your ears but in the very marrow of your bones. A sound like weeping. It's the sound of your city crying, the sorrow of the streets you've walked, the grief of the very land you love. What would you do if you were the only one who could hear it? What would you do when the warning born from your love becomes a one-way ticket to a hell of loneliness and ridicule? Look, shards of shattered colored glass glittering like crystalline tears in the hungry glow of a fire. A voice echoes, not from lips, but from the depths of memory, a voice ragged with a pain that could tear the soul apart. I saw it all, not the fire from an enemy's sword, but the fire from our own cold hearts. The camera pulls back, revealing a figure kneeling amidst the wreckage of a once magnificent art studio. This is Kael, his face smudged with soot, his eyes wide with a sorrow too vast for tears. He isn't weeping for what he has lost. He is weeping for what he knew and what no one would believe. Today, we are not telling a story of kings and wars. We are telling a story of the most terrifying kind of silence, of a whisper ignored, and of a devastating secret Kael kept until the very end. A secret not about the future, but about the true identity of the one who was destroying them all. A truth that might forever change the way you see collapse, betrayal, and hope itself. So stay for a moment. Before we turn the first page of this tragedy together, do us a favor. Let us know where you are in the world right now and what time it is on your clock. Drop a comment so we know that in this moment, across the miles, we are all here to listen to one story. In the city of Aethel, the glittering jewel of the south, light was more than just light. It was a language. It danced and sang through 1,000 masterfully crafted stained glass windows, telling tales of heroes, of gods, and of the glorious history of a people who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization. The very air in Aethel seemed to shimmer, scented with the dust of philosophy from debates in its marble squares and with the sweet, intoxicating perfume of self-satisfaction. And in that world of light and color, no one understood its language more intimately than Kael. He was not a warrior nor a politician. He was a maker of stained glass, a young man with a quiet disposition, eyes that held a distant sorrow, and hands that could coax silent glass into speaking vibrant poetry. His workshop, tucked away in a cobblestone alley, was his sanctuary, a world filled with the scent of linseed oil, pine resin, and the fine, glittering dust of his craft. His closest, perhaps only friend, the one soul who seemed to grasp the complex tapestry of Kael's inner world, was Leon. Leon was a poet, a man of words, pragmatic and articulate, a bridge between the introspective Kael and the boisterous world outside. Leon could translate Kael's chaotic emotions into clear verse, and Kael could transform Leon's poetic ideas into radiant glass. They were two halves of one artistic soul. But then one day, Kael's world began to crack. Not the panes of glass on his workbench, but the images inside his own mind. At first, it was just a recurring dream. He'd see the great windows of Aethel's cathedral, masterpieces his own grandfather had helped create, suddenly marred by a hairline fracture. He'd watch, helpless, as the cracks spider-webbed outwards, silently, relentlessly, until the entire magnificent facade would disintegrate into a million motes of glittering dust, cascading down in an awful, soundless rain. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He tried to dismiss it as the stress of his work, the fatigue of long hours. But the visions began to bleed into his waking hours. While grinding a piece of sapphire blue glass, he'd see it momentarily flash to the dead, ashen gray of cinders. He'd look at the smiling faces of people in the market and see, just for a second, a hollow emptiness behind their eyes. And then the voice came. It wasn't a sound he could place. It was a feeling, a sorrowful resonance that vibrated up from the flagstones, a weeping that had no source yet seemed to come from everywhere at once. It spoke of a rot from within. It spoke of a city so in love with its own reflection that it had forgotten its soul. It warned of an inevitable collapse, not from the steel of the mighty Vardian Empire to the north, but from the selfishness, the decadence, and the apathy that was eating away at Aethel, day by silent day. Kael would clutch his head, collapsing onto the cold floor of his workshop. "I'm going mad," he'd whisper to the dust motes dancing in the light. "It's finally happened." The fear was immense, not of the terrifying images, but of the crushing loneliness of being the sole keeper of such a terrible secret. He tried to ignore it, to drown it out with work, to lose himself in the vibrant colors, hoping that tangible beauty could banish the intangible horror. But the voice only grew louder, the visions more vivid. The whisper was becoming a desperate scream. Leon was the first to notice the profound change in his friend. He saw the new gauntness in Kael's face, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his gaze would drift to a point far beyond the workshop walls. "What is it, Kael?" Leon finally pressed, his hand firm on his friend's trembling shoulder. "You can tell me anything. You know that." And so, Kael told him. In a halting, broken whisper, he poured it all out. The shattering glass, the hollow faces, the mournful voice that haunted his every waking moment. He expected pity or perhaps a gentle suggestion to see a physician. Instead, Leon was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked Kael directly in the eye and said something that changed everything. "Kael," he said, his voice steady, "what if it's real? What if you're not going mad? What if you are the only sane man left in this sleeping city? You cannot keep this to yourself. You have to speak." Emboldened by the one person who believed him, Kael found a sliver of courage. He was no orator. He was a man who spoke with glass and light, but he had to try. For the love of Aethel, for the terror that if he remained silent, the horrors in his mind would spill out into the world. He didn't know it then, but his decision to speak was the first step onto a path far darker and more painful than any vision he had ever endured. The city council of Aethel convened in a hall of breathtaking grandeur. Sunlight streamed through a massive, domed, stained glass ceiling, painting the marble floors in shifting rainbows of light. The atmosphere was one of solemnity and self-importance. Kael stood before them, feeling small and out of place, a simple craftsman in a room of giants. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to still the frantic beating of his heart. At his side, Leon gave a subtle, encouraging nod. "Honorable leaders," Kael began, his voice trembling slightly but clear. "I stand here today not as an artisan, but as a son of Aethel, one who loves this city with all his being." He began to describe what he had seen, not with the polished rhetoric of a politician, but with the raw, unvarnished honesty of an artist. He spoke of the great windows, their pride, cracking from an unseen pressure. He spoke of vibrant colors fading to ash. He tried to convey the feeling of a creeping emptiness, a spiritual sickness that was draining the life from their home. A hush fell over the great hall. It was not the hush of rapt attention, but of uncomfortable, skeptical silence. A few of the elder council members began to whisper amongst themselves, exchanging knowing, dismissive glances. Then Lord Valerius, the head of the council, rose to his feet. He was a man in his prime, with immaculately groomed salt and pepper hair and an air of calm, unshakable authority. Valerius was a figure of immense respect in Aethel, a pragmatist, a brilliant strategist who had guided the city through external threats before. He smiled at Kael, a smile that was at once paternal and patronizing. "Kael, my boy," Valerius began, his voice a warm, persuasive baritone that filled the hall. "We commend your passion. Your love for Aethel is palpable. Your artistic soul is a treasure. You see the world through a different lens, a lens of emotion and symbolism. It is a beautiful thing." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the council, ensuring he had their complete attention. "However," he continued, his tone shifting subtly, We live in a world of hard realities. Our threat is tangible. It is to the north. It is the disciplined legions of the Vardian Empire. It is siege engines and forged steel. That is our enemy. Valerius walked towards Kael, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder. These tales of internal rot, of spiritual cracks, they are poetic, Kael, but they are dangerous. They sow doubt. They weaken our unity at the very moment we need it most. Aethel is not rotting. Aethel is strong. Aethel will stand. A single clap, then another, and then the hall erupted in a wave of applause. The council members, the scribes, the guards, they wanted to believe Valerius. They needed to. His words offered security, a tangible enemy they could fight, a certainty they could cling to. Kael's words were abstract, frightening, and they demanded an uncomfortable self-reflection they were unwilling to perform. Leave the matters of war to the generals, and the matters of state to the statesmen, Valerius concluded, turning back to Kael. And you, young artist, return to your workshop. Continue to create beauty for Aethel. That is how you can best serve your city. Kael stood frozen, the words washing over him like a bucket of ice water. They hadn't just disbelieved him, they had trivialized him. They had elegantly, politely dismissed his warning as the fanciful delusion of an artist. He glanced at Lion and saw in his friend's eyes a flash of frustration and anger. As they walked from the hall, the whispers followed them like ghosts. A dreamer spreading fear. What do you expect from an artist? Kael now understood. His battle wasn't just with the visions in his head. It was with an entire city that had willfully chosen to be deaf. In the wake of the council meeting, a silent war was declared in the streets of Aethel. It was not a war of swords, but of narratives, a battle between two opposing visions for the city's soul. On one side was Lord Valerius, the embodiment of reason, strength, and cold pragmatism. He launched a massive public works and propaganda campaign. Taxes were raised to fund new legions. The already formidable city walls were reinforced with another layer of stone, and grand military parades became a weekly spectacle, designed to soothe the public's nerves and swell their hearts with pride. In the sun-drenched squares, orators paid by Valerius preached a gospel of material strength, of ancestral glory, and of the single, clear-cut enemy to the north. His message was simple, powerful, and deeply comforting. Trust in our walls, trust in our armies, trust in what you can see and touch. On the other side, there was only Kael. He had no treasury, no authority, no grand stage. His only weapon was an inconvenient truth. He no longer sought out the council. He walked the back alleys and the bustling markets, the places where the city's decay was not a metaphor but a daily reality. He would point to a merchant using weighted scales to cheat a weeping widow. He would point to a nobleman pouring expensive wine onto the ground at a lavish party, while the city guards on the ramparts had their rations cut. He would point to the beautiful, empty temples, where rituals were performed with flawless precision but devoid of any true faith. "Don't you see?" he would plead with anyone who would listen, his voice raw with urgency. "The highest wall cannot protect us from our own greed. The mightiest army will shatter if its soldiers have nothing to believe in. The real enemy isn't outside the gates. It is sitting at our dinner tables, sleeping in our beds. It is our apathy, our forgetting of the very values that built this city." But his words were like seeds thrown on stone. The people of Aethel, caught between these two narratives, chose the easier path. Believing Valerius made them feel safe, proud, and most importantly, it required no change from them. Believing Kael meant admitting their own complicity, abandoning their comfortable vices, and facing a deeply unsettling reality. The circle of isolation around Kael tightened. Neighbors who once greeted him with a smile now averted their gaze. Patrons who had once admired his work now canceled their commissions. In the taverns, a new cruel joke made the rounds about Kael, the prophet of broken glass. He became the city's eccentric, its nuisance, a walking ghost, reminding them of things they desperately wanted to forget. Lien was the only one who remained, a solitary pillar in Kael's crumbling world. Yet even he began to waver. He saw the deepening pain in Kael's eyes, the frantic desperation that was consuming him. Lien was a pragmatist at heart. He believed Kael, but he also saw that his friend's approach was failing spectacularly. "Kael," he said one late evening, as they sat in the cold, silent workshop, "your words are too harsh. They are like a bitter medicine no one is willing to swallow. Perhaps the truth needs a little honey." Kael shook his head, his eyes burning with a weary fire. "The truth doesn't need honey, Lien. It just needs to be heard." The duel between Kael and Valerius had become the central drama of the city. Valerius built walls of stone. Kael tried to tear down the walls in people's minds. Valerius recruited soldiers for an army. Kael tried to recruit soldiers for a conscience. And in this lopsided war, Kael knew he was losing badly. He felt like he was screaming into a hurricane, his voice swallowed by the roaring winds of complacency and fear. He had no idea that the most devastating blow was yet to come, and that it would be delivered not by his enemy, but by the one person he trusted with his life. In the days that followed, Kael sank deeper into a quiet despair. The sense of futility was a physical weight, a shroud he could not cast off. Every time he closed his eyes, the visions intensified. The city in flames, the silent screams of the people who had refused to listen. He decided on one last desperate act. If his spoken words were wind, perhaps the written word would have the permanence of stone. He would chronicle every vision, every warning, in meticulous detail. He went to Lien. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are the poet. You have the gift of order and clarity. Help me set all of this down on scrolls. We will seal them away, a testament for this city, a warning for whatever comes after." Lien agreed instantly, but a strange, conflicted light flickered in his eyes, a detail Kael, lost in his own turmoil, failed to notice. Lien saw an opportunity, not to preserve the truth, but to save it and to save Kael. He truly believed that if he could just soften the edges, blunt the sharpest points of the prophecies, people might actually read them. A more palatable message, a diluted warning. It was the only way, Lien told himself. He was doing it for Kael's own good. For days, they worked in the quiet of the workshop. Kael, in a feverish trance, would recount the raw, agonizing details of his visions. Lien would listen intently, his quill scratching across the parchment, but he did more than just transcribe. With subtle, clever artistry, he altered the words. Total annihilation became a time of severe trial. Betrayal from within was softened to an unfortunate misunderstanding. The death of the city's soul was rephrased as a necessary period of transition. He had transformed a cry of agony into a melancholy poem, an indictment into a gentle piece of advice. Weeks later, Kael was looking over one of the finished scrolls. At first, he didn't see it. But then a word, a single phrase felt wrong. It was too gentle. He quickly unrolled another scroll and another. The more he read, the paler his face became. It was all there, yet it was all wrong. The weight, the urgency, the soul-searing pain of his warnings, it had all been expertly, surgically removed. What was left was a harmless literary artifact. Just then, Lien entered the workshop. He saw the scattered scrolls on the floor and the look of utter devastation on Kael's face. He knew he'd been discovered. "Why?" Kael whispered, his voice cracking. "Lien, why?" "I did it for you, Kael," Lien cried, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate justification. "Don't you see? Your truth is killing you. They hate you. They call you a madman. I wanted to protect you. I thought if the message was softer, they would listen, they would believe, and you would be safe." Kael stared at his best friend, the only person in the world he had trusted completely. And in that moment, something inside him broke. This wasn't the betrayal of an enemy, motivated by malice. This was the betrayal of a friend, motivated by love. It was a blade twisted not with hatred, but with misguided compassion. And it was 1,000 times more painful than any public scorn. His solitude was now absolute. He was not just alone against the city. He was now utterly alone inside his own truth. He had lost the one person who had ever stood with him. It was the moment Kael truly shattered, not in a vision, but in the deepest part of his soul. The confrontation between Kael and Lian ended not with the sound of breaking glass, but of a breaking friendship. Kael, consumed by a volcanic eruption of rage and grief, screamed at Lian, calling him a traitor, the man who had murdered Aethel's last chance. Their raised voices spilled out into the alley, drawing the attention of passers-by. It was precisely the pretext Lord Valerius had been waiting for. News of the public disturbance, embellished into a tale of the mad prophet violently attacking his only friend, reached him within the hour. Valerius acted with swift decisiveness. He didn't want Kael dead. That would create a martyr. He just wanted him silent. The city guard entered the workshop. There was no violence. They simply escorted a spiritually broken Kael, who offered no resistance. They led him down into the city's underbelly to a damp, lightless cell reserved for public nuisances and the dangerously insane. Before the heavy iron door clanged shut, Lord Valerius himself appeared. He didn't look at Kael with the triumphant gaze of a victor, but with an expression that was almost sorrowful. "I did not want this, Kael," Valerius said, his voice low and grave. "But you left me no choice. Your words, the chaos you inspire, they are eroding the very foundations of Aethel. I do this not because I hate you. I do this because I love Aethel. Your silence is a necessary price for the city's survival." The door slammed shut, plunging Kael into absolute darkness and silence. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. Valerius's words cut him more deeply than Lian's betrayal, because they were built on a foundation of chilling, unshakable logic. In his own story, Valerius was the hero, Kael was the villain. There, in the dark, Kael began the longest night of his soul. He was forced to confront everything. The memories of a beautiful Aethel from his childhood, the pure friendship with Lian, the first moment he heard the voice, the hope he felt when Lian believed him, the humiliation before the council, the pain of public ridicule, and finally, the mortal wound of betrayal. It all swirled in his mind, a maelstrom of loss. Where had he gone wrong? Should he have stayed silent? Should he have screamed louder? Was the voice even real, or was it all just a sophisticated madness that had cost him everything? Kael looked up at the tiny slit in the ceiling, the only source of a faint, ghostly light. He no longer prayed. He no longer questioned. He just whispered into the darkness, "If this is the price of the truth, it is too high." Imprisoned, betrayed, abandoned by all, Kael had finally hit the bedrock of despair. He had lost his freedom, his friendship, his faith in himself, and his faith in the voice he once thought was his destiny. He could not know that outside his cold stone walls, his greatest nightmare was about to be unleashed. The silence he was forced into, which Valerius believed would save the city, was, in fact, the final silent prelude to the chorus of destruction. And then it began, not like a sudden storm, but like a fever that had been building for months and had finally broken. The war horns of the Vardian army sounded from the north, their call brassy and final. But inside Aethel, the response was not unity and resolve. It was chaos. Lord Valerius stood on the ramparts, looking down at the disciplined sea of enemy soldiers, and for the first time a crack appeared in his serene composure. His plans had been perfect on parchment, reinforced walls, superior numbers, abundant supplies, but he had forgotten the most crucial, most volatile element, the human heart. Below him, the city was consuming itself. His hand-picked generals, men chosen for loyalty over competence, began bickering over command, each wanting the glory for himself. The soldiers, weary from hollow promises and meaningless parades, fought with reluctance. They were fighting on orders, not from love for Aethel. An army without a soul is just an armed mob. The people who had so readily believed Valerius's comforting words now descended into panic. They discovered that stone walls could not protect them from fear. Wealth could not buy courage. Decadence was useless against a sharp sword. Aethel's fall wasn't a single heroic last stand. It was a death by 1,000 small internal failures. The eastern gate was left undefended when its garrison deserted to protect their own families. The central granary, instead of being distributed to the soldiers, was first hoarded by a group of nobles and then looted by the starving, desperate populace. Valerius's brilliant defense strategy collapsed not because it was flawed, but because there was no unified will to execute it. From his cell, Kael heard it all, the distant blast of enemy horns, the closer shouts of arguing generals, the screams of the people, the splintering crash of a city breaking apart from the inside. Each sound was a hammer blow to his chest. He had seen it. Not in detail, but in essence. Aethel was not being conquered. Aethel was committing suicide. Fires began to bloom across the city, not just from Vardian torches, but from riots and looting within. Black smoke choked the sky, turning the remaining stained glass windows into opaque, lifeless squares. The chorus of destruction had reached its terrible crescendo. Every one of Kael's prophecies had come true with a brutal, devastating accuracy. He had been right. But this victory tasted only of ash and tears. When a tremor from a nearby explosion finally shook the door of his cell from its rusted hinges, Kael stepped out, not as a liberated man, but as a ghost into his own graveyard. Aethel was silent now. It was the crushing silence of embers and empty streets, where the only sound was the wind moaning through the hollowed-out shells of buildings. The reality was worse than any vision because it had a smell. The smell of charred wood, of death, and of despair left to dry in the sun. He wandered aimlessly, his feet carrying him through familiar places now rendered alien. The square where he was ridiculed, the council hall where he was dismissed, the alleyway to his workshop, now just a pile of scorched bricks, and in that dead, oppressive silence Kael heard the voice again. But this time, it was different. It was no longer a desperate warning, no longer a cry of anguish. It was a whisper, faint and exhausted, a lament filled with a profound sorrow. But there was something else in it too, something Kael struggled to identify at first. It was gratitude. The voice whispered not in words, but in pure feeling, directly into his mind. Thank you for listening, when no one else would, for trying. And in that instant, Kael understood. With a clarity that was both shattering and illuminating, all the pieces of his tortured journey fell into place. The voice he had been hearing, it was never a distant god. It was never an external, supernatural entity. It was the soul of Aethel itself, the collective consciousness of its history, its culture, its generations of people who had lived and died on this land. A living entity, a dying spirit. It hadn't been punishing its people. It had been trying to save itself. It had been screaming in agony as it watched its own cells, its own children, turn on each other, destroying the whole. The city's fall wasn't a judgment from above. It was the final, inevitable symptom of an autoimmune disease. And he, Kael, had been nothing more than a single sensitive nerve ending, the last one to register the overwhelming signal of pain. He fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, and for the first time in a long time, he truly wept. Not tears of loneliness or despair, but tears of a vast, heartbreaking empathy. He wasn't the prophet of a god. He was the son who had heard his own mother crying and had failed to save her. The twist wasn't a relief. It was a sorrow deeper than any he had ever known, but it was a sorrow that finally horribly made sense. Amidst the ashes, where life seemed to have been extinguished forever, Kael began to see the first tentative green shoots of hope. He saw a familiar figure stumbling through the debris, trying to fashion a makeshift bandage for a wounded child. It was Leon. The poet's face was no longer articulate or confident. It was a mask of horror, guilt, and profound loss. When he looked up and saw Kael, he froze. Then a raw, ragged sob broke from his chest. "Kael, Leon stammered, the words catching in his throat. He didn't offer an apology. He knew none could ever be sufficient. Kael walked over, his own anger long since extinguished by the city's funeral pyre and washed away by his new understanding. He saw not a betrayer, but another grieving survivor, a friend who had made a terrible mistake out of love. He knelt beside Leon and without a word pulled his trembling friend into an embrace. In that silent hug, forgiveness was given and received. They were two survivors in a dead world. The failures and sins of the past seemed so small now, measured against the scale of the current tragedy. As they sat together in the ruins, Kael's gaze fell upon the shards of colored glass that littered the ground like fallen jewels, once parts of masterpieces, now just broken fragments. But in the faint light of the setting sun, they still shimmered, each piece holding its own color, its own story. Kael picked up a piece of sapphire blue. Its edges were sharp, but its color was still deep and beautiful. He turned to Leon, and for the first time in days, a clear thought formed in his mind, coming not from the voice of Aethel, but from his own heart. "These broken pieces," Kael said, his voice hoarse but firm, "they are not the end, Leon. They are the beginning. They are the materials." Leon looked up, a flicker of something fragile and hopeful in his tear-filled eyes. He looked down at the glittering shards, then back at Kael, and he understood. Without another word, they began. They moved through the ruins, carefully, patiently, picking up the scattered fragments of glass, the crimson of a sunset, the emerald of a forest, the gold of a sunburst. Each shard was a memory, a piece of their shattered, glorious past. It was slow, painstaking work, almost absurd amidst the vast devastation. But with every piece they gathered, they weren't just collecting the past. They were beginning to build a future. That simple act, the act of picking up the pieces, was the beginning of healing. The curtain had fallen on the destruction, and another, quieter and warmer, was slowly beginning to rise. In the days that followed, a strange rumor spread among the scattered, shell-shocked survivors. The story of the two artists, one once called a madman, the other a beloved poet, who were engaged in the bizarre task of collecting broken glass. At first, no one understood, but then a few people, driven by curiosity or a simple lack of anything else to do, began to join them. An old woman picked up a shard of amethyst, remembering the window in her lost home. A young soldier picked up a piece of ruby red, remembering the banner he had once sworn to defend. Slowly, a small community formed around this quiet, shared purpose. They didn't speak much, they simply worked together. And in that communal silence they began to heal, not only with each other but within themselves. One evening, as the small group gathered around a crackling fire for warmth, Kael stood up. The frantic urgency was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, settled calm. He didn't speak of visions or prophecies. He didn't claim to be a prophet. He told them his story, the story of the voice. He explained that it was the soul of Aethel, the cry of the very ground beneath their feet. It wasn't punishing us, Kael said, his voice warm and steady. It was trying to warn us. This collapse was not the will of some distant god. It was the result of our own silence, of our failure to listen to each other and to listen to our own hearts. He held up a piece of blue glass. We were so enamored with the perfect, unbroken picture that we forgot that its true beauty was in each individual piece. By focusing only on the glorious whole, we ignored the cracks that were forming in the parts. He looked at the faces around the fire, faces gaunt with hardship, but now lit with a new attentiveness. Our old covenant was with stone walls, with armies, with promises of strength. And it failed. We need a new covenant now, not with a distant God, but with each other. He placed the blue shard on the ground. Leon placed a red one next to it. One by one, others followed. A promise, Kael continued, that we will use these very pieces of our broken past, our mistakes, our sorrows, to create something new. A mosaic. It may not be as grand or as perfect as the old Aethel. It will have cracks. It will have scars. But it will be ours. Each piece will be one of our stories, and it will be stronger than any wall, because it will be built with truth, understanding, and connection. He was no longer the passive messenger of an unseen voice. He had become an active leader, a creator, a source of inspiration. His character arc was complete, not in being proven right, but in finding a new, greater purpose in the very heart of the ruins. The story of Kael and Aethel ends there, but its message has only just begun. It echoes across time and touches us right here, right now. Because if we are honest, how many cities in our own lives are slowly decaying from within? A relationship, a career, a community, perhaps even our own soul. How many times have we chosen to believe the comforting lies of a Lord Valerius, rather than listen to the hard truths of a Kael who dares to speak up? How many times have we silenced that quiet inner voice of our conscience simply because it asks us to change, to confront the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore? Kael's story is not an ancient prophecy. It is a mirror. It reflects a universal truth. The greatest collapses never come from an external enemy. They are born from internal silence, from apathy, from the cracks we choose to ignore. But, and this is the most important part, the story also shows us a fierce and resilient hope, that even from the most desolate ashes, from the sharpest, most painful broken pieces, we have the power to create a new beauty, a mosaic of our own becoming, pieced together from our lessons and our scars. Our journey, like Kael's, is not about avoiding the breaking. It is about having the courage to pick up the pieces, to look at them honestly, and to begin the work of putting them back together in a new way. If this story of finding a new light in the fragments resonated with you, if it made you think for even a moment about the mosaics in your own life, then do one small thing. Hit that subscribe button, because here on our channel, we believe that every story, no matter how broken, holds a new light waiting to be told. And we will be here with you to listen to them and to tell them. Thank you for being here.